On the 2nd of November 1936, a small crowd gathered inside Alexandra Palace in North London to watch something that had never existed before. Long BBC was about to switch on the world's first regular high-definition television service. No one in that room fully understood what they were building. They just knew it mattered. That night marked the beginning of something sacred, a shared national experience. A single screen, in a single room, gathering a family together the way a fire once did. For decades, British television carried that weight with something close to reverence. It informed, it challenged, it occasionally frightened people into thinking harder than they wanted to. And then somewhere along the way, it stopped. Tonight we are not doing nostalgia. We are doing something more precise than that. We are going to name the exact year British television changed. Not a vague decade, not a feeling, a specific act of law, passed by a specific government, that rewired the incentives of an entire industry almost overnight. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because here is the uncomfortable truth. The television you grew up with was not lost by accident. It was not simply the times changing, the way people like to say when they want to avoid blame. It was engineered, quietly, through committee reports, licensing law, and a bidding process so strange that even the people who designed it later admitted it nearly destroyed the very thing it was meant to protect. If you lived through it, you already sensed that something shifted. You remember when television felt like it respected you, when a Tuesday evening discussion program could hold 10 million people in total silence, listening to two men argue about philosophy. You remember the presenters who spoke to you as an adult, not as a demographic to be captured and sold. What happened to that? Where did it go? Stay with us, because before we get to the turning point, we need to properly understand what was actually lost. You cannot appreciate a theft until you know exactly what was in the house. Let's go back to the years when British television earned the word great, and see in real detail what that word actually meant. Picture a Tuesday night in the late 1960s. There is no remote in your hand, because remotes barely exist yet. There is BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. That's it. 3 doors into the entire world of moving pictures. And yet somehow, with so little choice, the programming behind those doors was extraordinary. This was the era when a broadcaster named Brian McGee could sit 2 philosophers down in front of a camera and simply let them think out loud, live, for the nation. His series on conversations with philosophers brought Bertrand Russell's ideas and the words of thinkers like G.E. Moore and Ludwig Wittgenstein into millions of ordinary front rooms. Extracts of those conversations were even printed afterward in a magazine called The Listener, so people could read what they had just watched. Think about that for a moment. A mainstream broadcaster once assumed the public wanted to sit with difficult ideas, not simplified, not dumbed down, just handed over, respectfully, and trusted to make sense of them. This was not a fringe experiment either. Public intellectuals like Sir Isaiah Berlin, Eric Hobsbawm, and Bernard Williams were treated as television personalities in their own right. Historian Melvyn Bragg built an entire career on the assumption that serious culture belonged on prime time, not tucked away after midnight. The BBC and Channel 4, once it launched, competed to produce the smartest, most searching discussion programs on air. Programs with names like The Late Show and Voices weren't ratings disasters. They were appointment viewing for a very large, very serious audience. And it wasn't only intellectual programming. This was also the golden age of British sitcom and sketch comedy, the era of Monty Python's Flying Circus, launched in 1969, tearing apart the rules of what comedy on television was even supposed to look like. These shows didn't just entertain a generation. They rewired what British comedy meant for decades afterward, and we still feel their fingerprints on the humor of today. Now here is the part that matters most for our story. None of this happened by accident either. It happened because of structure, because of regulation, because the BBC operated under a public service remit that legally obligated it to inform and educate, not merely to hold attention. And ITV, though commercial, operated inside a tightly controlled licensing system, overseen by a regulator called the Independent Broadcasting Authority, which held every regional franchise holder to genuine quality standards, reviewed periodically, not simply auctioned to the highest bidder. That single fact, the existence of a strict, non-financial quality gatekeeper, is the hinge this entire story turns on, because in 1990, that gatekeeper was abolished. To understand why that gatekeeper disappeared, we need to go back a few years earlier, to a mindset that was quietly building inside government, one that saw British broadcasting not as a cultural institution, but as a market that had gotten too comfortable. In 1985, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government formed a committee known as the Peacock Committee, tasked with examining how British broadcasting was funded and structured. Its resulting report, published in 1986, criticized what it called the BBC ITV duopoly. The report's underlying philosophy was simple, and to some seductive. Let the market decide what people want, instead of a handful of broadcasters deciding for them. At a private seminar on broadcasting held at Downing Street in 1987, Thatcher herself reportedly described ITV as, quote, the last bastion of restrictive practices. Think about the framing in that sentence. Restrictive practices, not tradition, not standards, restrictions. To a government obsessed with deregulating everything from utilities to financial markets, a broadcasting system built on quality thresholds and long-term regional accountability looked less like a safeguard and more like an obstacle. This is the part nobody tells you plainly enough. The erosion of British television wasn't a cultural drift, some vague shift in public taste that nobody could have stopped. It was ideology, applied deliberately to an industry that had never been designed to be treated like a supermarket. The government's '88 white paper, bluntly titled Broadcasting in the 90s: Competition, Choice and Quality, laid the groundwork for what came next. It proposed dismantling the existing licensing structure and replacing it with something radically different, franchise auctions, where television companies would effectively bid cash, real money, for the right to broadcast, with quality treated as a secondary hurdle rather than the primary test it had always been. At a time, most people had no idea this white paper existed. Why would they? It read like dry policy. But hidden inside those pages was a mechanism that would, within a handful of years, drain money directly out of the programs you loved and into government coffers and bidding wars instead. This is where our story turns from background into consequence. Because in November of 1990, that white paper became law. On the 1st of November 1990, the Broadcasting Act received royal assent. If you want a single date to mark the moment British television began losing its soul, this is it. The Act did two things that, together, changed everything. First, it abolished the Independent Broadcasting Authority, the body that had regulated commercial television since 1954, and replaced it with a new organization called the Independent Television Commission. Long paper that sounds like a minor bureaucratic reshuffle. It was not. The old authority had genuine teeth. It could deny a franchise renewal on grounds of quality alone, no matter how much money a company had behind it. The new commission's priorities would be shaped by an entirely different logic. Second, and this is the part that really matters, the Act mandated that every single one of the 16 ITV regional franchises would have to be retendered through a competitive process, one that combined a basic quality threshold with something ITV had never faced before, sealed cash bids. Whoever offered the government the most money, once they cleared that minimal quality bar, would win the right to broadcast to millions of people. Before we go further, if you're finding this as unsettling as we did researching it, do one small thing for us. Subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss where this story goes next. And once you're done watching, leave a comment telling us the one program from your childhood that you think television could never make the same way today. We read every single one. Now back to 1990. Almost immediately, the announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. High-profile outside bidders began circling franchises that, under the old system, would have simply been renewed to their existing proven broadcasters. Names like Richard Branson and Phil Redmond entered the fray. Even the Walt Disney Company reportedly explored a bid. Established regional broadcasters, companies that had spent decades building relationships with local audiences, suddenly had to defend their existence with a checkbook instead of a track record. Guidelines for the auction were published in February of 1991. The results were announced that October, with the new licenses set to take effect at the start of 1993. And what happened in those results would confirm every fear the Act's critics had raised. The most brutal example was Thames Television. For decades, Thames had been the broadcaster for London's weekday audience, a company respected for serious current affairs work and popular drama alike. Under the old system, that reputation would have counted for almost everything. Under the new system, it counted for far less than a strong balance sheet. Thames lost its franchise. It lost because a rival bid more cash for the license. A broadcaster with genuine institutional memory and craft was simply outbid, like a piece of property changing hands at auction, because that is quite literally what it had become. Elsewhere, some winning bidders had overbid so aggressively that the numbers barely made financial sense. One respected media journal later described the auctions bluntly as a mechanism that was, quote, widely criticized for taking money out of programming and encouraging speculative bidding. Companies that won franchises with sky-high cash commitments now had to find that money from somewhere. And there is only ever one place that money comes from in television: the budget for making programs. Even sympathetic observers within the industry, people who broadly supported modernizing British broadcasting, admitted the system had gone too far. A quality threshold was hastily introduced partway through the process specifically to stop what one industry figure called a feared disaster, essentially a last-minute patch bolted onto a mechanism whose core design flaw remained untouched. Long parliamentary debate at the time put it plainly: the costs of bidding for these franchises could only be met to some extent by cutting expenditure on programs. From 1994 onward, restrictions on mergers between the newly relicensed ITV companies were gradually lifted too, allowing larger broadcasters to swallow smaller regional ones. The patchwork of proudly local, regionally accountable ITV companies that had defined commercial British television for decades began consolidating into something closer to a single, centralized, profit-driven entity. The regional voice, the very thing that had made ITV distinct from a single national broadcaster, started to disappear. Let's slow down here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets glossed over in most retellings of this story, and it's the part that turns an abstract policy debate into something you actually lived through. Regional current affairs programming had once been one of ITV's genuine strengths. Local franchise holders were required, as a condition of holding their license, to invest seriously in regional news, documentaries, and investigative journalism specific to their area. That obligation had teeth precisely because a regulator with real power could strip a franchise from any company that failed to deliver on it. Once the auction system replaced that regulator's authority with a cash-driven tender, and once winning companies were saddled with enormous ongoing bid payments, something had to give. Investigative and regional programming, expensive, slow, unglamorous work that rarely drove massive ratings, became one of the easiest places to quietly trim a budget. None of this happened as a single dramatic announcement. There was no press conference declaring the death of serious British broadcasting. It happened through 1,000 small, defensible-sounding budget decisions, made by executives who were simply trying to survive under a licensing structure that had turned public service broadcasting into a financial gamble. By the middle of the 1990s, industry figures were openly debating whether the 1990 Act had been, in the words of one contemporary assessment published in the RSA Journal, a benefit or a disaster. The debate had already shifted entirely to damage control. And remember, this was all happening at the exact same moment a second. Entirely separate force was about to hit British television from a completely different direction. An invasion was arriving from the sky, quite literally, in the form of satellite dishes bolted onto houses across the country. That invasion would finish what the Broadcasting Act started. The numbers tell the story better than any opinion could. In 1990, there were fewer than 10 non-terrestrial channels available in the United Kingdom. By the year 2000, there were more than 100. Pay television penetration among households climbed from around 5% to roughly 25% over that same period. An entire generation of British viewers went from 3 channels to a bewildering menu of choice in less than a decade. Now, here is the uncomfortable contradiction sitting at the heart of this story. More choice sounds like it should mean more quality. Instead, it fractured the very thing that had made British television special in the first place. A shared national audience, gathered around the same handful of channels, all watching, discussing and arguing about the same programs the next morning at work. That shared cultural glue, the thing that let 10 million people sit in silence together for a philosophy discussion, cannot survive being divided 100 ways. Advertisers followed the fractured audience. Advertising revenue, once concentrated on a small number of channels that could therefore afford ambitious, expensive, slow-burn programming, now had to be spread across 100 competitors. Every single channel, terrestrial and satellite alike, found itself chasing a smaller slice of a shrinking pie, and the programs that could guarantee the largest possible audience, immediately, without patience, quietly became the only programs anyone could confidently afford to fund. This is the mechanism, not laziness, not a sudden collective loss of good taste among broadcasters. Simple, brutal economics, set in motion by a regulatory decision, and accelerated by a genuine technological revolution arriving at almost exactly the same moment. Now we reach the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to sit with, because it is the moment the consequences stopped being abstract policy and became the actual programs filling your evenings. Once regional franchises were financially squeezed, and once the audience itself had splintered across 100 channels competing for the same shrinking advertising pot, broadcasters needed a new kind of programming. Something cheap to produce, something that didn't require the years of trust building that a Brian McGee documentary series demanded. Something that could guarantee an immediate, measurable audience, because in this new financial reality, immediate and measurable were the only things that mattered. That is the honest, unglamorous explanation for why reality television arrived exactly when it did, and why it stayed. Serious discussion programming didn't vanish overnight either. It was quietly pushed later into the schedule, moved to smaller channels, or trimmed in budget until it simply couldn't compete for prominent broadcast slots the way it once had. Long public intellectuals who once anchored prime time, figures with the stature of Isaiah Berlin or Bernard Williams, found fewer and fewer platforms willing to give them the space television once considered completely normal. Their successors today, brilliant people, genuinely, simply don't command the same scale of shared national attention, because the structural conditions that once delivered that attention to serious programming no longer exist. By the time Channel 5 launched on the 30th of March 1997, the last national analog terrestrial channel Britain would ever build, the pattern was already fully in motion. Nearly 2.5 million people tuned in for its launch night. And yet Channel 5's very existence proved how far the old model had already shifted. It launched not as a public service institution built slowly around trust, but as a licensed slot, sold competitively, in a landscape already reorganized around audience share and advertising revenue. The 2000s brought the next seismic shift, and if you lived through this decade you felt it happen in real time. This was the decade reality television fully took over. Shows built around constructed drama and cheap production costs moved from the margins to the absolute center of British broadcasting. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, further consolidation continued relentlessly. In 2004, Granada Television and Carlton Television merged to form a single company, ITV plc, effectively finishing the process the 1990 Act had set in motion. Then came the digital transition. Starting in Whitehaven in 2007, the gradual switch-off of Britain's analog terrestrial signal began, region by region, finishing in 2012. Long same year, an American streaming service called Netflix arrived properly on British screens, and within a few short years it would change how an entire nation consumed moving pictures. Think about the symmetry of that timing. The very year British television finally, completely, left analog behind was the same year the platform that would eventually dwarf every terrestrial channel combined quietly arrived on these shores. The BBC had already launched its own on-demand service, iPlayer, back in 2007, sensing correctly that appointment viewing itself was becoming an old-fashioned concept. But iPlayer was built to serve existing BBC content. Netflix and the platforms that followed it were built to replace the entire ecosystem terrestrial television had spent 70 years constructing. By the 2010s, watching the box at a fixed hour, with your whole family gathered in one room, the very image we opened this video with, had become closer to a nostalgic memory than a nightly ritual. Smartphones, tablets and personal computers took over as the primary screens in British homes, competing for attention against an infinite scroll with no shared national schedule at all. So if you ask exactly when British television lost its soul, we can now give you a real answer, not a shrug, not a vague gesture at the 90s. It happened on the 1st of November, 1990, when the Broadcasting Act became law and quietly replaced quality with cash as the price of admission to broadcast into British homes. Everything that followed, the fractured audiences, the squeezed budgets, the retreat of serious programming, the rise of cheap disposable content, flows directly from that one decision. That doesn't mean nothing good has been made since. Of course it has. There are still documentary makers doing extraordinary, careful work, still occasional moments of real ambition breaking through on British screens. Long, but they now exist despite the system, not because of it, fighting for space and funding that was once simply guaranteed by regulatory design. If you lived through the years before that change, you are one of the last people who can actually remember what was lost with any real precision. Not as an abstraction read about afterward, but as a genuine felt memory. The hush in a front room during a serious discussion program, the sense that television assumed you were intelligent enough to be trusted with real ideas. That memory matters. It's evidence, and evidence has a way of disappearing once the generation that holds it stops speaking about it. So don't let it disappear quietly. If this changed how you see the television you grew up with, tell us in the comments which program, which presenter, which single evening in front of the set you think could never be made the same way today. We genuinely want to know, and we read every comment. If you found this useful, give the video a like, and if you know someone else who remembers those years, someone who would appreciate hearing the real story behind the change rather than another vague complaint about how television used to be better, share this with them directly. And if you want more of this, real history, real documents, real dates, instead of nostalgia dressed up as fact, subscribe to the channel now. Because the story of how a nation's culture quietly changes, one piece of legislation at a time, rarely gets told this plainly. And it deserves to be.